Let's talk about the book of James. So you want to know what James is all about? Let's talk about the big picture. I want to give you a quick overview of this quirky little book. And this book is kind of funny. And here's the funniest thing about this book is Martin Luther, one of the great heroes of our faith. Martin Luther didn't even think this book belonged in the Bible. And part of that is because it's kind of a tricky book to deal with. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're looking at this. And I'm going to give you a quick overview. And I'm going to give you the 3 key verses you really need to have to understand James well, so you have a framework to study it with. So the book of James is a weird cross between wisdom literature and epistolary literature. So epistolary literatures are letters written to people, and then wisdom literature usually has a bunch of wise sayings in it. And James has this odd combination of both, and it's very cool. And James actually clears up a couple of key theological issues for us in a way that other books don't because of the way the book is built. First key verse you need to understand is James 1:22. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. And that call to action from James is very important. He's very blatant about that. He's very clear about that. And that's one of the reasons that Martin Luther didn't think it belonged, because we know that salvation is by faith alone, and we don't actually do any work. And it sounds like James is telling us, go do some work. But actually, that's not true. Actually, we're saved by God's grace through faith, not of works. But true faith always results in works. Works don't create faith, but faith always creates work. So we're not saved by our works, but a saving faith produces works. And I think that's what James is getting at very well. And he starts that right off in the very first chapter of his book. The second key verse you need to know to understand the book of James is verse 27 of the same chapter. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And what I love about this verse is that it preaches against an inactive faith. If you think you're holy and you're awesome and that everything's good with you and God, and yet you live in an ivory tower and you never serve others, you're not following the Christ of this Bible. Many people like to have a Jesus in their mind that is a lot like them, thinks like them, talks like them, does everything like they do it. But the Jesus of the Bible is going to consistently call us out of complacency and into a place of service for others, ultimately for God's glory. And James has a solid grip on this. He's dealing with apathetic Christians and saying, hey, you got to come out and you got to do this. You say you're religious, but you're not serving widows and orphans. You've missed the point. Now, the point of religion is not completely all in serving widows and orphans. Some people think that because they've served widows and orphans, now they're qualified religiously. And actually, religion is ultimately about the worship of God, but that should express itself as we serve others, if that makes sense to you. Another great thing that James points out in chapter 2, verse 10, is that if someone keeps the whole law but fails in one point, they're guilty of all of it. And this is great because it ties back into the doctrine of total depravity. It comes into Romans 3:23. This is the salvation message. If you've sinned at all, you're guilty of all of it before God. And a just God has to send you to eternal destruction. And that's why salvation is so beautiful, because we've all failed, at least partly, in some parts of the law. And as people who have failed to have Christ love us anyway, to redeem us anyway, to ransom us from our sin anyway, that is a wonderful, beautiful thing. And James encapsulates this idea of, we need Christ. We can't get him ourselves. We can't work there. But if we're not doing things in service of our King, then we don't really know the real Christ. And I love how James just puts this together. Now, I do think ultimately James falls under the category of epistolary literature. So I'd encourage you to go check out my video on how to interpret epistolary literature biblically. And then you can watch that video, and then you'll know some questions you need to ask as you go through James that will help you understand this book and draw out its truths even better than you have before.